Hello, my name's Gavin. This is Genre Books, and continuing my little sub-series of spicy pulps. I am today finishing with spicy Western stories. This obviously linked to June on the Range, and they have been thematically linked since March. Spicy detective stories for March Mystery Madness, spicy adventure stories in April for Spring into Adventure, spicy mystery stories in May for Horror Mayhem, and now spicy Western stories. And fourth time around, I find myself casting around for something fresh to say about these magazines. Pulp stories can be samey in their plotting and in their writing styles, but these spicy stories turn that up a notch or two. There are stylistic similarities between the writers because of what they are told to include and what they are told that they cannot include. There are rules about what you can call certain parts of the anatomy, or rather rules of what words you cannot use. I can't recall any description of a backside, for example. Not that I was particularly looking for descriptions of backsides, but there being so many descriptions about the female form in these stories, it seems an odd thing to leave out, but there was obviously a rule in place that you weren't allowed to. There are plenty of hips mentioned, and there's certainly no description of male anatomy that other than a sort of vague, nebulous manliness exuding from these characters. That and their quickening pulses, which I think is the euphemism used. It's samey too because it's the same writers being used over and again, switching between the genres. In general, a number of pulp writers could turn their hands to a number of different genres. Someone would be able to write science fiction and adventure and westerns. Someone would be able to write adventure and westerns and romance. Someone would be able to write romance and sports. Here the genre is spicy, and the actual genre of the magazine, western, detective, adventure, is almost a secondary trait. The writers are employed because they are able to write spicy pulps to spec. And this is why we find the same writers turning up over and again. Robert Leslie Bellum, Edwin Truitt Long, H. Bedford Jones, Lawrence Donovan. Some names you recognise turning up because they are using the same name over and again. Other writers are hidden under a palimpsest of pseudonyms. These pulp stories are never going to break boundaries. They are defined by the boundaries that are in place from the editorial team, from the various anti-vice groups in New York. Everybody has their rules about spicy pulps. Nevertheless, these spicy pulps were influential on pulp magazines as a whole. Pulp covers could have anything depicted on them. Detectives, cowboys, aliens, sportsmen, but it's the depiction of women on those magazine covers that sold the magazines. It's a point I've made before, and it's certainly not an original observation, that the covers with the scantily clad women on them sold more copies, so the publishers made sure they became a staple feature of those covers. And if you are a writer wanting that cover story, you had better include a scene with those characters in order to be depicted on the cover. Spicy pulps at least have a little bit of honesty here. There is no pretense about the inclusion of these characters. It's their entire raison d'etre. Harry Donenfeld and Frank Armour created this subgenre all of their own. They had been forced to tone down their earlier schmoosh pulps like Juicy Tales, Hot Stories or La Paris stories by the civic groups, the anti-vice busybodies I mentioned earlier. These spicy pulps were a compromise of sorts. The spice was toned down and given genre settings. There is usually bad humour, suggestive situations, generic violence, hallmarks and cliches of the genres they were depicting, and stock character types. Spicy Western Stories is the last title I am reviewing in this little series, and it's the last of these titles to have been published coincidentally. It's also the worst selling and the shortest lived. There were about 60 issues of Spicy Western Stories before they rebranded as Speed Western Stories, the content in the magazine having been toned down further in order to try and appease these civic groups who would probably never ever be appeased. Why the Western was the least popular of these spicy genres, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps the hallmarks of the Western genre were already too familiar to reading audiences, and let's be blunt about it, usually were low on female characters, sometimes entirely bereft of female characters. The Western world is very much a man's world. In the spicy Western stories, you have to have lots of women characters. Readers may have found this a little more unbelievable or incongruous than adventure or detective or mystery. Detective stories always had the sleazy underworld. Adventure stories had the exotic locations and unknown tribes of people. Mystery stroke horror, to be frank, had the bondage and the peril elements. All of these things, a little scuzzy, a little bit of a frisson, a little bit of a titillation, spice, in other words. The Westerns had none of this, but they were being written by the same authors who had honed their spicy skills in these genres that had come out first. Sometimes with these spicy Western stories, it seems just a little forced, and also the outcome is relatively tame compared to the other genres. The issue I read was from February 1941, Volume 7, Issue number 3. I'll talk through some of the stories, but I've got to say, sort of by this point, trying to recap all of these spicy stories, I'm really not adding a huge amount. The formula has become so very apparent to me. But we begin with Shotgun Stew by Dale Boyd. That's another pseudonym for Edwin Truett Long. Double crossing here, misunderstanding, and crucially, not very spicy. E. Hoffman Price, an established writer in other titles, and bravely never using a pseudonym for his spicy works, with She Herded Him Around. There is much more meat to this story, but it's still not hugely spicy. There are some good action scenes and an incredibly dumb protagonist. There's also a distinct lack of suspense or surprise here, because there is a big twist which is completely undone by a footnote on the first page explaining that something like this had really happened. It completely pops the balloon of any suspense, and I do question why that ended up there. I really hope that was not an editorial decision. I don't think the author would have been happy at all to have the main idea given away on page 1. The next story is Six Gun Wedding by Larry Dunn, and it's Larry Dunn is the writer I want to talk about today, because that is a pseudonym. Larry Dunn is Lawrence Donovan. He had an incredible amount of pseudonyms. I haven't got them all here, but there are some to go through. For Nick Carter and for the Shadow, he used the name Walter Wayne. In Detective Story magazine and Western Story magazine and the Pulp Clues, he would use Patrick Everett and Patrick Lawrence. Under the name Wallace Brooker, he created Captain John Fury for the magazine The Skipper. In both The Shadow and Doc Savage, he would have stories under the byline Austin Gridley. For The Whisperer, he was Clifford Goodrich. For The Phantom Detective, he was Robert Wallace. For G-Man Detective, Detective Fiction Weekly, Spicy Detective and Spicy Western, he was Don Lewis, Don Lawrence and Larry Dunn. His biggest claims to fame, if you can have a claim to fame under a pseudonym, is that he also wrote some of the proper Doc Savage stories under the house name Kenneth Robeson, alongside the arguably more famous Lester Dent. He wrote 9 of the Doc Savage novels from 1935 to 1937. 3 of those Doc Savage novels were adapted as early Superman stories. Lawrence Donovan is one of those writers who just seems to be everywhere in pulp literature, as well as all of those titles I mentioned. He's also in Sports Story magazine. He's in The Black Bat. He's originally a newspaperman who moved into pulp. It's literally A to Z with Lawrence Donovan, from Argosy to Zeppelin stories. He just seems to be someone who was pretty much everywhere in the 30s and early 40s. But back to today's story, Six Gun Wedding. The blurb says Barney couldn't believe his ears when the girl he had never met before asked him to marry her, but it put his dander up when he found her punchers backing her up. There is a tight plot going on here. It does cram more than a few strands into its few pages. Perhaps there is too much crammed in to make room for the spice. This story does rely on a few fairly unbelievable coincidences, but it's all still quite fun. Some of the other stories in this magazine are less successful. An example of this is Lynch B by Wallace Caton. It was a war between the cowboys and the miners, with the vigilantes taking a part. When Weston butted in, he found it expedient to introduce still another faction, and soon even the women of Hawksville were playing a hand. This story is straight into a fistfight within the first few paragraphs, but there are far too many characters introduced in too short a story, and it becomes these factional things, and there's a romance, and there's a fake romance, and there's some double crossing, and the character turns out to be a range detective, so it ends up a little bit messy. But that was still more believable than Stan Warner's Girl in the Saddle. I don't think the girl actually ends up in a saddle at all in this story. That's probably by the by. Anyway, the blurb says, pursued as an outlaw, the stranger takes the first refuge he can find and has the chance to show his gratitude to the girl who saves him. This is definitely the most unbelievable romance yet. Yeah, I didn't find this one credible at all, and not exciting enough or interesting enough a plot to compensate for that. I feel like I'm ending this little sub-series on Spicy Pulps on a little bit of a downer, and I don't mean to, because for all of the faults, some of these can still be quite charming. I think if and when I come back to Spicy Stories, it's going to be incidental to what I'm looking at rather than the whole focus of what I'm looking at. I think reading too many of these stories from around the same time of publication from the same writers jades the palate somewhat. When too much of the same kind of spice is applied, it doesn't feel spicy anymore, if that makes sense. What this little series has allowed me to see, however, is how this publishing concern of Harry Donenfeld had its impact on the wider culture. We've seen everyone turn up in these reviews, from Superman to Lassie, the Lone Ranger to Doc Savage. Everything in Pulp world is connected. We've had the writers who have stayed in that spicy lane all the way through, like Bellum, but we also have writers established elsewhere, like E. Hoffman Price, appearing under his own name in the magazines. We have Robert E. Howard appearing in one of these magazines, the only time he used a pseudonym to cover his spicy shame. And looking at the Spicy Pulps is also a great example of the influence exerted by these civic groups. So that's an end for the spicy for now. There was no spicy science fiction, so Rocket Summer will remain unblemished by their spiciness. I may return one more time in Garb August to take a look at these schmoosh pulps, because that's something I've not yet seen. But perhaps not a 4-video series. But until next time, bye.